The 1980s turned out to be a great decade to have a car. There were many changes taking place within the auto industry, but it was also a time when many of the old muscle cars from previous decades were cheap to buy. The decade had plenty of options if you didn't want to roll with the changes. Overall, they were smaller than those produced in the mid to late 1970s. Sales were up and down, which forced manufacturers to come up with new ways to entice buyers. In the early part of the decade, the U.S. tried restricting imports so that sales on domestic cars would increase. American automakers also tried offering cash rebates. When those efforts failed, Chrysler introduced the 5-year, 50,000-mile warranty. The early 80s car was pretty boxy and they had defined lines throughout the vehicle. By the end of the decade, they became more streamlined, lightweight, and aerodynamic. Many of the cars moved away from steel bumpers and instead opted for plastic ones. Safety standards in cars were beginning to change, and many states started enforcing seatbelt usage with laws. Another safety change was the third brake light becoming mandatory in all cars starting in 1986. Light trucks would not see this mandatory change until 1994. Luxury cars started having more options than ever before. The digital speedometer began replacing the analog one, and at one point they were leaning towards cars that would actually have voice feedback to the driver. Time has moved on and somewhat dated both of those features. In 1982, the first American-built cars from Honda rolled off the assembly line in Marysville, Ohio. That plant still produces Honda Accords to this day. The Japanese car market started becoming more competitive than ever with the rest of the world. By 1987, Nissan and Toyota announced that they would enter the American luxury car market with Infiniti and Lexus. The automakers Hyundai and Mazda also saw an increase in sales. Another interesting foreign car in the 80s was the Yugo. You know, you go when you push. It came with a rear window defogger to keep your hands warm while you were pushing it. Just kidding. This car had a ton of jokes about it because it was tiny and basic. But the Yugo had an extremely low price, so it really was an affordable option for many. By the end of the decade, buyers had more choices of foreign cars than they had ever had before. This trend would carry over into the 1990s. One of the most iconic cars of the 80s is a DeLorean, thanks in part to the popularity of the movie Back to the Future. Unfortunately, the founder of the company, John DeLorean, was arrested on drug charges and his company went under. By the mid-80s, cars were starting to get a little bit more power than they had had in previous years. Exotic sports cars became a fantasy of a lot of people thanks to shows like Magnum PI and Miami Vice. The Dodge Chrysler Corporation had a couple big moves in the 1980s. They led the way in the minivan market with the Dodge Caravan, and soon other auto manufacturers tried to follow their success. In 1987, Chrysler purchased the largest and oldest auto manufacturer in the U.S., which was AMC, for $1.1 billion. This move now meant that Chrysler owned Jeep, and this was huge. You may not know exactly what year a car is, but there is definitely no mixing it up when you see an 80s car. A lot has changed since then, including the seats. Back then, it was much more common to see velour, and they were really soft and cushiony. Even the leather seats seem softer. Technology in cars is completely different now, as is everything else in the world. No one thought about it at the time, but cars from the 80s are desired. Some editions are even huge collector's items. It's possible you may even see some of these at car shows.
Visible to a few. Someday you'll